$50,000. That's what the average full-blown American wedding costs today once you stop lying to yourself about the "we're keeping it small" plan. And here's the number that should actually stop you mid-scroll. $50,000. Invested instead of spent, growing at a modest 7% average market return, becomes just over $380,000 in 30 years. Not from a bonus, not from a lottery ticket. From one afternoon of chicken or fish and an open bar. So before you write this off as just a wedding video, stick around because this is really a video about the most expensive single day most Americans will ever willingly pay for and what that day is quietly costing them on a spreadsheet nobody shows the happy couple. Let's start with where the $50,000 actually goes, because almost nobody budgets it up front. They back into it, expense by expense, until the number is simply too big to be shocked by anymore. The venue and catering alone typically eat up nearly half of it, somewhere around $22,000 to $24,000 for a venue rental, plus a plated dinner and bar for roughly 120 guests. Photography and videography, because apparently memories need a 4K crew now, run another $3,000 to $5,000. The dress, the suit, alterations, hair, makeup, call it $3,500. Flowers and decor, another $3,000. A DJ or band, $2,000. Invitations, favors, the cake, transportation, the officiant, another few thousand scattered across a dozen smaller line items that each feel small until you add them up and realize they're basically a used car. And that's before the honeymoon, which tacks on another $5,000 to $6,000 for the average American couple. Individually, every single decision feels reasonable. That's the trap. Nobody sits down and decides to spend $50,000. They decide 60 small things, and the math does the rest. Now here's where it gets interesting, because the way we usually talk about the cost of a wedding is wrong. We compare it to other one-time expenses, a used car, a semester of college, a modest kitchen renovation. But a wedding isn't really a purchase, it's a moment in time, and money has a property that purchases don't. It can grow before you spend it. So the honest comparison isn't a wedding versus a car, it's a wedding versus what that same money would have become if you'd waited. And that's where the real math lives. Let's run the numbers properly. Say a couple is 28 years old, planning a $50,000 wedding, and instead they scale back to a still very nice $20,000 wedding. Beautiful venue, great food, just fewer of the extras nobody remembers by the second glass of wine, and they invest the $30,000 difference in a simple S&P 500 index fund inside a retirement account. At a historically reasonable 7% average annual return, by the time they're 58, that $30,000 has grown to roughly $228,000. By 68, it's over $448,000. They didn't add another dollar to it. They just let 30 or 40 years happen. That's the part almost nobody factors in when they're picking between the $14 a head chicken and the $22 a head filet. Every extra dollar spent at 28 is not just a dollar, it's a dollar that's been fired from its job of compounding for the next 4 decades. But, and this is the fair part, the part that keeps this from turning into a guilt trip video, this math only bites if the money would have actually gone toward investing in the first place. If the alternative to a big wedding is not index fund, but slightly nicer apartment for 2 years, or a car with heated seats, then the opportunity cost isn't $448,000, it's basically zero, because that money was never going to compound anyway. The real question this video is asking isn't should you spend less on your wedding, it's do you know specifically what you're trading the money for? Some couples know exactly what they're doing. They have family wealth covering the big day, or they've calculated that the wedding is genuinely worth more to them than the compounding, and there's nothing irrational about that. Money is a tool for buying experiences too, not just future numbers on a screen. This isn't a video telling anyone their wedding was a mistake. It's a video making sure the trade was actually a choice, and not just a chain of small yeses that added up to a car's worth of debt with balloon arches. Speaking of debt, here's a stat that deserves its own moment. Roughly 1 in 3 couples goes into debt to pay for their wedding, and the average amount financed is around $15,000 to $17,000. If that's sitting on a credit card at a 22% interest rate and the couple pays it down at $400 a month, that debt doesn't disappear in a year. It takes over 4 years to pay off, and by the time it's gone, they've paid roughly $4,000 to $5,000 in interest on top of the original bill. That's not the cost of the wedding. That's the cost of the wedding plus a tax for not having the cash up front, a tax with no upside, no compounding, no memory attached to it except a folder of statements. And this is exactly the piece that turns a $50,000 day into a $55,000 day. Quietly, 18 months later, when nobody's thinking about the wedding anymore, they're just thinking about the bill. Now let's talk about the guest list, because this is where the math turns almost comedic. A $50,000 wedding for 150 guests works out to about $333 per person. For a 5-hour event, that's roughly $10,000 an hour. Cut the guest list from 150 to 90, which, statistically, is closer to the number of people most adults could actually name off the top of their head as close to them, and at that same per-person cost, you save around $20,000, just from the list. No cheaper flowers, no cheaper dress, nothing visibly budget about the day at all, just fewer chairs. And this is consistently the single biggest lever in wedding math, bigger than negotiating the caterer, bigger than DIY centerpieces, bigger than skipping the champagne toast, because almost every other cost on the list scales per head. Fewer guests means less food, less rental furniture, smaller venue, fewer favors, a smaller cake, sometimes even a smaller venue rental fee. Cut the guest list by 40%, and you often cut the total cost by close to 40% too. And yet it's the line item couples are most afraid to touch, because it feels personal in a way that swapping peonies for ranunculus never does. Here's a stat that tends to make people sit up straight. A widely cited study out of Emory University, looking at thousands of American marriages, found that couples who spent more on their wedding tended to have shorter marriages on average, and couples who spent less, particularly under $1,000, tended to have some of the lowest divorce rates in the data. Now, before anyone panics, correlation is doing a lot of work in that sentence, and it's not that spending money curses a marriage. The more likely explanation is financial stress. Couples who go into debt for one day, or who feel pressure to keep up with a wedding budget beyond their means, are often carrying that same financial stress pattern into the marriage itself. The wedding isn't the cause. It's a symptom of a bigger habit, the habit of letting social pressure set the price tag instead of math. And that pattern doesn't stop at the altar. It shows up again at the first house, the first car, the first kid's birthday party, if the underlying habit never gets examined. Let's zoom out to the bigger financial picture, because a wedding rarely happens in isolation. It's usually stacked right next to two of the biggest expenses in a young adult's life. The average couple getting married is somewhere in their late 20s, which is exactly the window when they're also trying to save for a house down payment and, ideally, starting to invest for retirement while time is still their biggest asset. A 20% down payment on the median US home right now is somewhere around $85,000. So a $50,000 wedding isn't just competing with a distant retirement number, it's competing with more than half of a house down payment at the exact moment a couple might need it most. That's the real tension in wedding math. It's not wedding versus nothing, it's wedding versus the next milestone, arriving fast, usually within 1 or 2 years, while it's still recovering. So what does a genuinely well-optimized wedding look like, mathematically? It's not necessarily a cheap wedding, it's a wedding where every dollar was a decision instead of a default. Off-season or Friday/Sunday weddings can cut venue costs by 20 to 30% instantly, because venues discount for lower demand days the same way airlines discount red-eyes. A brunch or lunch reception, instead of an evening dinner, cuts catering costs significantly, sometimes by a third, because the expected menu and the expected bar tab drops dramatically before 4 p.m. Buying a sample sale or previous season wedding dress instead of a made-to-order gown can be the difference between $2,000 and $200. A 4-person cover band sounds expensive until you compare it to an open bar running for 6 hours instead of 4. The math almost always favors cutting bar hours over cutting music. None of these moves make the wedding look cheap on Instagram. They just make the invoice look different, and that gap, the gap between what a wedding looks like and what it costs, is where almost all the real savings hide. There's also a quieter piece of math that almost nobody talks about. The vendor markup that comes purely from the word wedding. The same flowers, the same cake, the same rental chairs, priced for a wedding instead of a corporate event or birthday party, routinely run 20 to 40% higher, not because the product is different, but because the demand curve for weddings is famously inelastic. Couples don't shop around the way they would for, say, a mattress, because there's an emotional urgency to getting it right for the one day. Vendors know this. It's not a conspiracy, it's just basic pricing psychology, and it's exactly why some couples save thousands simply by never using the word wedding out loud when they call around for quotes. Now let's put a number on what actually matters here, which is the 10-year picture, not the one-day picture. Take 3 couples. Couple A spends $50,000 on the wedding, finances $15,000 of it, and pays it off over 4 years with interest, total real cost around $55,000. Couple B spends $25,000, all cash, no debt. Couple C spends $12,000, smaller, intimate, still genuinely beautiful, and invests the $38,000 difference from what couple A spent. 10 years later, assuming similar income and saving habits otherwise, couple C's invested difference alone, untouched, just compounding at 7%, has grown to roughly $75,000. That's on top of whatever they were already saving for retirement or a home. Same marriage, same love, same day, arguably just as memorable, since studies on wedding satisfaction consistently find almost no correlation between how much a couple spent and how happy they say they were with the day itself. The guests don't remember the price of the flowers. They remember whether the couple looked happy and whether the open bar closed too early. So who does the big wedding actually make sense for, financially and otherwise? Couples in a strong financial position already, house fund secured, retirement contributions on track, no debt. Spending $50,000 on a wedding is simply a lifestyle choice, no different from a nice car or a big vacation, and there's nothing to correct there. Couples whose families are covering costs as a gift, without expectation of repayment or strings, that $50,000 was never coming out of the couple's compounding timeline in the first place, so the whole math above doesn't even apply to them. And couples who've done the math, looked at the numbers, and decided the experience is worth more to them than the theoretical future value, that's not financial illiteracy. That's just a values-based decision made with open eyes. The people this video is actually for are the ones who haven't run the numbers at all, who are choosing the venue based on what their cousin did, financing the difference on a card at 22%, and not realizing that the same $50,000 left alone was on track to become a down payment, a fully funded emergency fund, or a decade's head start on retirement. Because that's really the thesis underneath all of this. A wedding is one of the only major expenses in adult life priced almost entirely by social expectation rather than utility. Nobody negotiates their retirement contribution based on what their coworkers are doing. Nobody buys a car because that's just what a car costs in our friend group. But weddings run almost entirely on comparison. Average spend, average guest count, average vendor package, and averages by definition include every couple who went into debt to keep up with an unspoken standard nobody actually wrote down. The math doesn't say spend less. The math says know the number, know what it's replacing, and make sure the version of the day you're paying for is the one you actually wanted, not the one the average produced for you by default. Run your own numbers before you sign a single contract. Take whatever your target budget is, subtract what you'd genuinely be comfortable financing if it came to that, and multiply the difference by what 30 years of compounding would do to it. That one calculation, done on the back of a napkin before you ever tour a venue, will tell you more about your wedding budget than any Pinterest board ever will. If this kind of breakdown, the real math behind the big purchases everyone makes but nobody actually calculates, is useful to you, subscribe, because this channel exists entirely to run these numbers before you have to learn them the expensive way, and hit like if you made it this far, because that's genuinely the best way to help this video reach the next couple standing in a florist's office about to say yes to the upgrade.